For example, this antlion here that we see as an adult, which is a winged individual that flies around and can capture prey, starts its life out as this larvae that lives in the soil. So these are very different habitats that they live in, and the kinds of food that they eat are very different. Okay, and so of course, selection is going to select for different kinds of features in this larvae versus adult. Same thing is true for the sea urchin. Okay, sea urchin starts out its life as a free-swimming larvae that kind of has to deal with all kinds of predators in the environment, and then eventually settles down into an adult that's herbivorous and will just walk along the substrate slowly scraping off algae. Very different kinds of life means different predators that you have to worry about and different foods that you have to worry about. And so it actually increases the chances for the species that if not all the larvae make it, but some eventually do, right? That the adults have different kinds of things that they have to face. So this complexity allows more advantages and more likelihood for individuals to be able to face those evolutionary challenges in order to survive, grow, and reproduce. All right. In the world of development for insects, we have those that we call hemimetabolists. Okay, and those are insects that start out as eggs that develop into these sort of miniature adult-like forms called nymphs. They're not entirely identical to the adult. Many times they don't have their wings yet. And we saw some of these when we did our arthropod lab and we were sifting through the critters in the jars that we often found some nymphs that hadn't yet fully developed. Okay, and then those nymphs will molt several times. So molting is a discrete form of reproduction that allow individuals to get larger and larger in size, not continuously, but in a very discrete fashion. So many insects may undergo 5 molts or 10 molts or 8 molts or some particular number, which is very specific to a given species. All right, and then here we have this adult grasshopper that has its wings. And again, that's an example of a hemimetabolous individual. Sometimes this is also called incomplete development. All right, and that is as in contrast to the holometabolous insects that start out as an egg, which develop into larvae. Often there's several larval stages that may undergo some molts, but then there's this more dramatic metamorphic transformation into a pupae, just like in the butterfly, right? Butterflies are holometabolists too. They transfer from a caterpillar to a chrysalis. Well, chrysalis is just another word for a pupae. And then these darker pupae that emerge from the larvae, eventually the adult fly emerges out of the pupal casing. So again, very different kinds of environments and challenges for the eggs versus the larvae versus the pupae versus the adult. For some species, the larval habitat may be so favorable that metamorphosis is delayed or eliminated entirely. And for example, in this salamander, Ambystoma here, normally, or very often rather, the aquatic form of the salamander will metamorphize into a terrestrial adult that looks like this, like a salamander that you're used to thinking of. But these tadpole-like aquatic stages, sometimes the conditions are so favorable, they're like, why get out of the water, right? Why metamorphize? Whereas you can just become sexually mature and stay aquatic. All right, so they develop into a sexually mature adult, but they still have the gills here, and they still have the tail, and so you have this sexually mature adult. Okay, and so that's what we refer to as a pediomorphic aquatic adult for these salamanders. And we see this in some other species too. I kind of like to think of it as, you have a young teenager and it stays at home and it's so nice there, like why ever leave? And then the guy turns, he's in his 30s and his 40s and he still lives at home with his mom, right? And so even though he's technically a mature adult, he's still sort of living in a juvenile environment, and that's kind of like a weak metaphor. But the idea of the same thing, staying in the same juvenile habitat, and retaining some of these features, probably more importantly, retaining the features of a juvenile in terms of the tail and the gills is, again, what we're really talking about when we talk about pediomorphosis. So when we're talking about life cycles, this sort of animal-centric view of a life cycle is pretty familiar to us. We start out with a diploid adult, right? By now you guys should all know that the 2N refers to having a 2N number of chromosomes, so that adults are diploid, right? And then they undergo meiosis to form haploid gametes, right? These are words that you should have learned in Bio 111. Right? So the gametes have half the amount of genetic material, right? So eggs and sperm are haploid, then they undergo fertilization to form a diploid zygote, which grows up through a series of mitotic divisions, right? All the cells being identical, although they can differentiate into different kinds of cells, like a liver cell or a skin cell or a hair cell, right? That is done through differential gene expression, as you probably also learned about, right? So a series of mitotic division ends up in forming the diploid adult, and the cycle continues. In this kind of a life cycle, only the diploid stage is multicellular, right? The haploid stage is just a single cell, egg or sperm. Okay, and only the diploid stage is really this free-living organism, whether juvenile or adult. And we'll see that for other kinds of organisms, this isn't the case. For example, life cycles in plants are quite a bit different. Plants and algae undergo what's called this alternation of generations. Okay, so you might start out with a diploid multicellular organism that's often referred to as a sporophyte. Okay, and they're called sporophytes because they produce spores. Okay, and the diploid sporophyte produces haploid spores, of course, through meiosis. Okay, needs to be able to divide meiotically in order to produce a haploid stage. Right, so these haploid spores then grow up actually into a haploid multicellular adult-like organism. So again, different than animals where you only have a unicellular haploid stage. In plants, the haploid spores undergo meiosis to produce a gametophyte, okay, which is a multicellular haploid stage. Right? And gametophytes are called gametophytes because they produce gametes. And what are gametes? Gametes are things like eggs and sperm, right? So the gametophyte will produce either eggs or sperm, is usually male and female individuals. Okay, which then fertilize each other to become the diploid zygote that undergoes a number of cell divisions to become the diploid sporophyte generation. Okay, so here's an example of a plant, an alternation of generations. Here's the adult sporophyte, which is a diploid adult fern. You guys are probably familiar with these. And the gametophyte generation looks really small. You probably have never seen it. It's kind of this heart-shaped thing, and it's small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. Here you can see it in this beaker next to someone's hand. So, again, the gametophytes are haploid, and they produce sperm and eggs mitotically then to produce haploid gametes. But eventually when the egg becomes fertilized by sperm from another individual, the sporophyte begins to grow right out of the gametophyte and eventually grows up into the adult fern. And here's just a recap of that fern life cycle. You should pause the video and actually just spend some time going through this life cycle on your own. Many species have really ultra-complex life cycles, such as parasites. And this particular flatworm parasite has a pretty complex life cycle where it goes through several intermediate hosts, such as birds and snails and frogs. And so there can be quite a bit of complexity and different morphological forms for each of the stages. One particularly nasty parasite that is, again, related to the flatworms is schistosoma. And this critter is really notorious for causing some pretty debilitating diseases in humans, and is known to hang out in the waters in and around different parts of Africa and Egypt and the Nile River. And so again, this is actually showing a male and female worm together. The male is the larger one and the female is the skinnier one, and she kind of exists within a groove in his body, and the male and female pair end up as adults inside the circulatory system of a human being eventually. But they go through these aquatic stages where they're partly free living and partly living within a snail, and then these different kinds of hosts. So just to show you how complex life cycles mean that each of the different stages has a variety of these different selection pressures that they have to contend with, and that they actually increase their chances of finding a host by reproducing so prolifically. So as I've mentioned, the different one of the reasons to have complex life cycles is that different forms, these different stages within a life cycle of any particular organism, can experience the environment in different ways, right? And so they can have different kinds of challenges that they have to face, and also different ways in which they may be able to be successful. And having this complex life history can do a number of things, which is one of which is to reduce or remove competition across life history stages. So here we see the sea star, which starts out as a larvae early on in its life. It hatches from fertilized egg, or develops from a fertilized egg. And then the adult sea star over here that's crawling along the intertidal zone. But when it's a baby, when it's a larvae, it has to really watch out for these mussels here that are filter feeders and feed on larvae. But when it's an adult, it actually eats the mussels for dinner. So there's different relationships that this organism has with this other species, these mussels, depending on what stage in the life the sea star is at. One big advantage, at least in marine benthic organisms like barnacles and mussels and other kinds of those invertebrates that reproduce by producing larvae, and even many fish that kind of just hang around in a very sedentary way near the bottom of places in different places in the ocean, that the larvae eventually end up dispersing into different environments. So the fact that juveniles have different requirements from adults means that they're likely to disperse away from the natal ground. And increasing dispersal in order to occupy new habitats and new environments can be a major advantage for a species. So these advantages for dispersal, reducing competition with the parents, escaping from higher mortality, having lower extinction rates, that we can kind of test this hypothesis that it's better to be a disperser than a non-disperser by looking at non-planktonic versus planktonic larvae. So if you're planktonic, that means you're going to go out in the water column and float around and disperse into different areas. So these are really the dispersers here. And if they're non-planktonic, they settle down and hang out and basically are not dispersing. Okay. So if you look at the average amount of time that non-planktonic species have persisted in the fossil record compared to those that are planktonic that have existed in the fossil record, you can see that non-planktonic larvae have been around each species has been around for about 2.2 million years, whereas planktonic larval species have persisted on an average of about 4.4 million years. So in any rate, this is at least some evidence that having a larvae that's capable of dispersing into different environments may give the individual, and therefore individuals within those populations, and therefore the whole species, some kinds of advantages. Another characteristic of species that may constrain their life history is the number of reproductive events that they may have during their lifetime. So there are certain species that are known as semelparous species, and these are species that reproduce only once in their lifetime, usually in kind of a big bang event. You've had all your offspring and then you die somewhat shortly after that, as opposed to those species that are actually more common, and they're known as iteroparous species. Kind of sounds like iteration, so many times. These species can reproduce multiple times, maybe lay several different egg sacs or have different bouts of offspring multiple times throughout the lifetime.